Hello and welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you with us. Sierra Wiley is not with us this week, so I'm taking over the introduction here. I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, a professor emeritus of Renaissance and Reformation history from Central Connecticut State University, and I've got my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries at eSquareInch.org, and I write a lot on Substack. Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology and Christian ethics at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. I also serve as a minister at a church in Plainville, Connecticut.
Yes, and we have a special guest this week. Evgeny, why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, my name is Evgeny, but in the U.S. I go by Eugene. I was born in Russia, USSR, to be precise, and in the city of Omsk, and my wife and 3 children live in Houston. I'm a professional translator. I started translating books in 1993, and I've done quite a few theological books, and then I started writing about maybe 20 years ago, and I still do.
Yes, and actually it's your writing that caught my interest. I've been following you on Substack for the last few years. Your Substack is called Philosophy of Language, which I was a linguistics major. That caught my attention. But I was rather surprised at the direction you went with it. So can you talk about the kinds of themes you cover within the Substack?
Yeah, well, mainly I cover the love of language because that's what caught my attention when I first read the Inklings. And all of them are pretty much fascinated with language and the sound of language. And basically, which goes back to God saying the world into being, speaking the world into being. And we still hear that sound everywhere, I believe, in all the created matter. It's sacramental and participatory within that sense.
Yes. So Tom, are you going to jump in?
No. You can go on. I will get back to that, though. Sacramental and participation. It's a favorite topic.
Yeah. On the show, we have done a lot with the Inklings. We've done an awful lot with C.S. Lewis and a pretty good amount with Tolkien, and occasionally moved into Barfield. We haven't quite gotten to Williams yet, but I'm sure we will at some point. So what intrigued me as I've been reading your material is the range of sources that you bring in. You do talk about the Inklings, you talk about Tolkien, Lewis, and all Barfield, but you also bring in Heidegger. You were talking about Barth. So how do you think about integrating all of these things together? You seem to have a very creative mind in that area. So. Can you talk a little bit about how you are doing or what you are doing with bringing in all these various sources?
Well, it's a good question. You kind of caught me with that one because I haven't thought about that. But it seems like I go by resonances when I read like Karl Barth, and I'm not a specialist, but I'm just a kind of amateur, and I read this and that. And I find things that resonate. And I really like the idea of resonances, like comes from Latin, resound. Like, something sounds and then it resounds inside of you, resounds. And so, generally I would say that when I discovered phenomenology, like Heideger and, basically 20th century thinkers, I find that I resonate so much with what they say. And Heidegger is surprisingly on the same wavelength with the Inklings in terms of language. His intuitions into languages are amazing.
I was going to think maybe it'd be helpful for our audience to give just a maybe even a caricature of what phenomenology is in relationship to language, because some of them they may have heard the term, but they may not understand what's going on there and why that's a distinctive philosophy that has a certain emphasis.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I would say for me, phenomenology, I once had a friend of mine, a philosopher, explain it in very simple terms, and I just go by that.
Yeah.
So in popular terms, in scientific terms, the Earth revolves around its orbit, and it revolves around the sun, orbits the sun. But it's not the way we perceive it.
Yeah.
We perceive it the other way around.
Yeah.
And so phenomenology is really concerned with, does it really matter? And if it doesn't, then a lot of things must disappear, like horizon, sunrise, sunset, all the things that make the world the way we know it and love it, and the world that makes sense disappears immediately. And then, of course, to me, that kind of brings me to, I believe it's Psalm 9, where it says, who is man that you made him pretty much the center, that you remember. By remembering us, God kind of puts us in the center, and sort of like the whole world is for us and revolves around us, that type of feeling. So,
yeah, it's interesting because, sorry, Glenn, it's interesting that phenomenology, and I think even Barth, like you said, I did my dissertation on Barth, but they really talk about the way or the significance in theology, especially with Barth, and the way in which God comes to us in Christ, right? And the way Christ comes to us in our world and enters in our territory. And that is the way we step in. So it's almost even a phenomenological approach back to God. God comes to us in the world that we experience. And it's from the world we experience that we're pushed through our experience to the world where God resides in a way. And so language here isn't about just trying to capture a scientific description from a scientific outside point of view, but it's very much the way the world comes to us from the Creator and the way we experience it. So that's what I kind of hear in what you're saying there.
Yeah. Well, it is also Christ himself, I would say, because Christ is God revealer. He reveals that which is invisible in the visible form.
Yeah.
And that's how we experience. I mean, the disciples, for sure, when they saw Christ, they weren't really doing anything scientific in their brains, or they were just experiencing that, wherever they could see him. And that was enough. The experience of the Word was enough for Father to be revealed.
Yeah.
That's really interesting to me as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I was in seminary and then in grad school, I did 2 master's degrees on the way to my PhD, but they were both dealing with the concept of accommodation in Scripture. Now, accommodation is used in a bunch of different ways. In this case, what it refers to is sometimes called condescension. It's the way in which an infinite and holy God communicates to a finite and sinful humanity. Basically, in Calvin's terms, he lisps to us the way a nurse talks to babies.
Yes, yes.
So one of the ways that this shows up is in phenomenological language. So without phenomenological language, you can't talk about sunrise and sunset, as you pointed out. For my students who are very who don't get this, I used to ask them, how many of you have seen a sunrise? And hands would go up. Okay, how about a sunset? Hands would go down. I'd say, none of you have seen that. None of you have seen a sunrise or sunset. What you've seen is the sun either coming into view or going out of view as a result of the turning of the earth. You have not. The sun did not rise.
Exactly.
But the problem is, the way we experience, as you say, the way we experience the world is something really different from that. I used to tell people I was a soft heliocentrist. The idea being, if you follow Einstein through, there is no center, there is no, everything is relative, and so there's no reason why, for practical purposes, you can't view the Earth as the center.
Exactly.
No.
Exactly, because it's a dance, really a dance. We're all revolving around the center of the Milky Way, so the sun revolves around the Earth, whether you like it or not.
So now, as I was a linguist as an undergrad, and the thing that I was most intrigued by with language is when you view things A linguist does not believe that sounds have any intrinsic meaning. Okay, they're completely arbitrary. So what intrigued, now I'm not sure I believe that anymore, but what intrigued me at the time was that I could produce this arbitrary set of vibrations in the air, and suddenly a thought that is in my mind becomes a thought in your mind. That struck me as being essentially magic. The entire phenomenon of language itself, I just found just that point. It just incredibly wondrous, frankly.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, what Tolkien does, Lewis does, the Inklings, is they go the next step and they do the thing that modern linguists don't do, and they say the sounds matter. They're not just completely arbitrary. There is a connection between the sound of the word and the reality. So that was, I always wanted that to be true, but they sort of beat that out of you in your undergrad in linguistics. And I was really glad to sort of rediscover that with Lewis and Tolkien.
Yeah, I'm reminded as you're talking. I'm reminded of this chapter in I'll say like a line in the Silmarillion where I believe it's Iluvatar. No. Somebody explains the magic of water, the sound of water, and says that water, of all the substances created by God, Iluvatar, water contains the most of the music, original music, than any other substance. And that's why the sound of music causes so much yearning for something that we, or the elves, we cannot understand what it is we're listening to when we, like the rain is coming or we are near a waterfall. We can sit there for hours and we certainly hear music, but we don't know what it is and what exactly we're hearing. And it's really, also another thought I had, it really relates very closely at least in my understanding, with what Heidegger says about essential speech, meaning that the reason we speak is not because we speak or I speak or you speak. It's because we hear the speech out there that is addressing us. We hear this. The speech is, how did he say that? He says basically that the only reason I can speak is because there's essential speech coming toward me all the time. And we can hear that speech. If we're attuning to it, we can hear that speech, all of us. And then I can say something. And if it's in line with that essential speech, you will probably be hearing something very insightful and similar, on the same wavelength at least. So we're all kind of immersed, plunged into that essential speech going into us from almost like from God. And that's the only reason that our words and sounds really produce so much resonance, or can produce if we're in tune
with it. Yeah. That's interesting language there. I mean, what we're talking about in many ways is communication. There is the capacity, as Glenn mentioned, the magical capacity for me to take sound, and that sound, as you say, resonates in someone else. And that resonance is what I'm trying to communicate in many ways. Yeah. Now, we know that sometimes it can break down, but still, it's amazing. When I teach a class, I always, especially a philosophy class, I always talk about, what is going on when I'm just up here making a bunch of physical movements and sounds, and yet you're able to pretty much interpret the meaning that is intended, it's trying to be communicated, and you're hearing these sounds and you're digesting the content. You're making sense of it in ways similar to what I intend. And so it is this connectedness that language is pretty much the central medium, both in gesture and sound.
If your students are getting what you're saying, then you're either a better communicator than I am with my students, or your students are better than mine were. Because
it's always a challenge.
I've got a rather lengthy list of student bloopers that I should probably share with you sometime, but that's actually another story altogether. Yeah, I actually wanted to go back to water. Because one of the things I actually think you may have written about this, one of the things that's really intriguing is that if you can produce patterns in water using sound, every pitch creates its own particular, if you put a speaker under a plate with water in it and you play a tone, it will create a pattern in the water. You'll see it in the ripples. And the higher the pitch, the more complex the ripples get.
Wow.
And you can also do this with sand too, but it's easiest with water. Every single pitch has its own distinctive waveform that shows up in the water. So water doesn't only produce music, it responds to music.
Wow. Yeah.
And
it's amazing. I read something about that, but I don't know much.
Okay, then it wasn't your post. Okay.
No.
Well, it was, of course, that one of the first philosophers we know, right, Thales of Miletus, that water was the one stuff, if you will, that really was at the heart of things. So this is kind of fascinating that Tolkien and the Silmarillion and is thinking along these lines, and he's taking one of these kind of what you consider fundamental elements of reality, and he's connecting this meaning communication right at the heart of it. And like you said a bit earlier, when you understand the logos behind it all, then you see this is a great sign system. And it's interesting that he's going to put a strong emphasis on water's capacity to be a very strong sign system, one integrated with more than just language and sound and meaning, but sound almost moving into a deeper kind of meaning that we find in something like music that doesn't only give us information, but draws us into something, into reality in much richer ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, I'm subscribed to a couple of channels here in Houston that pretty much people just post about their walks along the shore, like of the sea, the Gulf, and it's interesting just to read their comments. It's like the ocean is talking to me, and there's some communion, almost like in communion terms. Something is happening. I hear. I return to myself, and it's very interesting to hear those comments.
Yeah.
And then also, going back to Tolkien, it's interesting that he said that in water there still lives the sound of the original music more than in any other substance. And I'm wondering if that's what we intuitively sense when we go around the world, and we kind of sense where that music is the most audible, the most heard. And I would say, water is for sure is one of the, closest to my heart, but there's also other ways, other substances that really, really speak to me. But it's just a mind-blowing concept to me that we can still get to hear at least some of that original logos word. Because, the Inklings, of course, talked about the Babel as the kind of a dividing line between the proto-language, which carried that sound in a much greater degree as opposed to post-Babel, the curse of, the division of the languages and the curse that basically Lewis talks a lot about, that we only get the fragmented language, fragments of words.
Yeah.
We don't hear the sound as a holistic thing, which was there somehow. Yeah. And of course, Pentecost is somewhat a reversal of that curse. Yeah. And of course, Lewis and Tolkien talk about poetry as the return to the proto-language that is somehow still present in water and in other substances as well.
Well, and then you have the first sacrament. I mean, we're talking, baptism, for those that see it that way. You're talking right at the heart of the new life, the new birth, and you're being immersed in one sense, or at least going through going through a connectedness with water that is bringing one into this new life and new creation. So the echo is somehow fully there, even in that. And it's interesting because music is the way that Tolkien communicates the creation story. It's told with this kind of melody going out, and there's a lot of rich stuff going on there. And I hadn't really thought about that section where he talks about water carrying that kind of that deep connectedness to it. But that's something I want to go back and look at. It's a lot there.
Yeah, Coleridge, I think it's in several of his poems, but he was really big on nature. And he talked about in nature hearing, he didn't use this phrase, but essentially hearing the primordial language. That when you are in nature, when you truly see nature, you are actually hearing and you apprehend a kind of primordial language that God has spoken into the world. That is, trying to remember the specific poem. It's a poem where he's talking to his son, Winter. I don't remember the name of it, but this was, again with the poetry, this was a fundamental thing for Coleridge, who argued that what poetry does is it allows you to see the world as it really is, rather than, as he puts it, masked by the veil of familiarity. It opens your eyes to what the world really is and allows you to hear that primordial language again.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think that comes up in certain philosophies that are fashionable is that sort of poetry, and then is everything is kind of poetic now, but in a very raw sense, that it's just a human imaginative construction, that it is more about an romantic expression about the person or what they want or desire, but it's not connected to reality in these deep ways. And so what Tolkien is saying, and I think some of these philosophers you mentioned, they're arguing something very different, that yes, it includes us, but we're not the full reality from which the significance of what we're trying to say poetically comes. We're actually participants in a larger reality for which that's the better language to capture the heart of reality, where scientism only, we're removed from it in many ways, or we think we are, and it's not making us a part of the whole thing. And then Romanticism, in some forms of enlightenment ways of thinking, detaches itself and just thinks of it as the person's own contribution only, but they're not connected to reality. So what Lewis and Tolkien and others are saying is that when we're more deeply connected to reality, poetry is probably the only way to begin to capture how rich reality is.
Yeah.
I think I read this quote by Mark Vernon just the other day. He's quoting William Blake, I believe. So we're not, we don't do imagination. We are imagination.
Yeah.
Divine imagination. I'm being imagined right now. You guys are being imagined right now, because pretty much everything that I see in this room at one point was imagined by the designer. Yeah. And so it's basically the incarnation of that.
Of that imagination.
So the trees are there. I mean, they existed and still exist in the mind of God. And that's just amazing, mind-blowing, that we are participating in the divine imagination. But, I was also thinking that it's really interesting in the Inklings' view of imagination is basically it's our capacity, especially Owen Barfield, of course, it's our capacity to penetrate the appearances, and really catch the design, the blueprint, the divine icon behind, or the idea of the world, the idea of the tree, or the, in Platonic forms,
forms
and things like that. So this is pretty amazing. And I think once I started getting it really changed my perception of what is around me. It's such a joy to look at a tree and see more than the appearance allows.
Yeah.
Because there's communion there, and of course, when you read Isaiah, that talks about the trees clapping hands. Years ago, I would read that, and it would just it's just poetic something, and I don't know, it's just nothing. Or even Genesis chapter 1, like the Spirit was hovering over the waters. Okay, it's a nice way to put it, but it doesn't really mean more than it. I don't know. But it's actually, poetry. Even the very first words in Genesis, in Septuagint, are God poeo. God made, he poeted the world into being, which is also very, very musical. And so I believe that initial word, whatever he said, let it be or something, I don't know. But it must have been that really, the sound as it originally was. So.
Yeah. There's so many different directions to go with this. I think one of the problems that we have today is that most people in America simply don't read poetry. The closest that they're ever going to get to poetry is song lyrics or rap. But I think if you actually ask them, all right, what is it that poets do? I think they would say that what poets do is they've got a weird way of expressing themselves, but what they're doing is talking about themselves and their own feelings and perceptions and things like that. A lot like art is seen as self-expression. Whereas, again, if you go back to Coleridge or the earlier poets, that's not what poetry is. It's not about me expressing myself. It's about me looking at the world and expressing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's a very different way of looking at it.
Yeah, and this notion, I think, is often, I mean, it's very lost to a lot of Westerners in particular, but this pushing through the surface to get a hold of this pattern you've both been talking about. And I often write in the field of ethics, but it's very similar. It's how do we begin to see the good that is there again? It requires what earlier thinkers, participatory thinkers, would call contemplation. But contemplation isn't just hiding in your room and meditating for 10 hours. It's letting the reality commune with you. And this is what is so rich about the creation is, and especially after Pentecost, if you want to put it that way, after Pentecost, there is an inbreaking of the Spirit and a healing of the brokenness of language and communication. And there is an allowing of us to begin to see this pattern in creation now without turning it into an idol, but turning it into a part of, the offering of our praise and delight in the Creator. And this is why you see, even in the New Testament, whenever they give an initial doctrinal introduction, say to Paul's letters, he automatically breaks out into doxology. Praise is right there. And then it even you look at Colossians, there's there's a hymn to Christ right at the beginning of Colossians about him being both the wisdom of God and the creator and the creator. And so there is this deep connecting at Christ's redemptive work back to that initial impulse, that creation, and everything that it resonates. And I think we often miss that. We jump right to the redemption, at least we do often in the West. We jump right to the redemption and ignore that this is also a seeing creation again in the light that Christ brings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like what you said about praise being right there, doxology. Yeah. I was wondering also in the book of Romans every once in a while that Paul would all of a sudden, he would be giving this argument, and all of a sudden he would just break into this, oh, praise be, all these things, like layers upon layers, of, I don't know. But then I realized, okay, that's where it should culminate in. That's the culmination of the whole thing, And yes, it kind of brings me back also to Heidegger, that spoke about, the connection between thinking and thanking. And he was basically, like in German, Danken and Denken, almost the same way. That people in our age don't think that they think, but they don't really think.
Yeah.
And we're in a modernity is in flight from thinking, he said, because there's no, unless there's participation, unless there's communion with the world out there, there is no appreciation, there's no praise, until there's doxology on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah.
I don't really think. I don't really think.
Yeah.
Even though I may think that I think.
Yeah.
So
and it is fascinating because, I mean, even in a figure like Thomas Aquinas, most people think of him from this, this dry scholastic thinking in these, Aristotelian terms, that are like mathematics rather than praise. But if you really penetrate at the core of what he's up to, it too ends up in doxology, and it's understood as a spiritual exercise of somehow being able to penetrate these very patterns that we're talking about. And I think that's very impressive that these theologians recognized how significant that deeper reality that we're given insight into should be ran after and not satisfied with the surface. And the other thing I wanted to say is I'm ever impressed by Heidegger, how his early theological education never fully left him.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that ties into all of this, and particularly our inability to really grasp a lot of this stuff, is something Vervaeke talks about. That we've got the left brain, which is very analytical and focuses specifically on detail, whereas the right brain thinks holistically. And he says that Western society has become excessively left-brained, so that it focuses on details, it focuses on analytical, kinds of things, but fails to think holistically, fails to see the big picture. And I think that's really connected to the kinds of problems that we're talking about here in terms of recognizing the doxological nature of reality. Recognizing that there is something that is going on that can't be simply quantified down to scientific categories or analysis.
Yeah. I think maybe that's why C.S. Lewis says in the Chronicles of Narnia, like, what do they teach them at these schools? Like, pray, it's all in Plato. This whole recognition thing, like, that we recognize, which means we cognize again. And it's basically that we, when we encounter a phenomena, phenomenologically speaking, what happens in us is experiential recognition of that. And unless that happens, we're still kind of scraping the surface, and we're not. That's interesting to me is like when you just spoke, is that both in Russia and here in the West, I see people that resist that type of thinking, and it's still such a surprise to me that sometimes I would in a conversation I would mention some connection that just comes to mind with this and that, whatever it is. Like when I'd be seeing like a duck on a pond, and I don't know, something pops up in my mind that is like, it reminds me of something, or it tells me, it speaks to me. I don't know, something like that. And once in a while I see people who would say, why would you even think that? It's a duck, for heaven's sake. What else is it? And I remember I looked up the etymology of the word art, and it comes from this Proto-Indo-European root for harmony. We get the same. The word arm comes from the same root and things like that. So and it's just like, wow. So when we do any form of art, whether it's drawing or poetry, we basically look for harmonies. In other words, we have to sense and recognize before we can really express ourselves artistically. So it's kind of going back to what you, Glenn, said, that art is not just my perception. It's what, yes, it is my perception, but it is something that I saw or recognized of that harmony out there. And then it comes into me, and it gets transformed somehow through me. And then, like Coleridge says, we can give from that heart. I forgot the exact quote, but how he puts it. But well, anyway, so it's just
it's
thought.
Very, very interesting you say that, especially, I mean, you've got, obviously got some history back with the USSR and well, first of all, you have a country, again, historically has a very rich sacramental theological heritage and orthodoxy in the iconography, and not losing sight, some of the theologians not losing sight of that dimension. But I know that, filmmaker like Tarkovsky and, during time you'd be familiar with, he would do these long stretches in film of just filming water. And again, you could probably speak to what he's up to with this contextually, but he was someone who was not trying to lose sight of that. And you could probably explain the reasons why he wasn't. Why a figure like him would spend so much time in that kind of.
See, I can only guess, but it's a good question. Thank you so much for saying. The Soviet Union was a really interesting phenomenon, I think, because I think Richard Kearney speaks about the phenomenon called anatheism, which literally means God after God, ana meaning again, or God again, which is basically, he says that it's the only way that we can talk about God after the age of concentration camps and after the Soviet Union and gulags and all kinds of things. So if you look at the Soviet era art or movies, what you see is basically anatheism. And I believe that's what Tarkovsky does too, is that it's a desire to find God in the sacred. And so they're looking for the sacred, or the sacred stranger, or the sacred sacrament in this or that. They don't call it sacrament, of course, but some presence of something sacred in all things. And growing up, we would feel that in books and in movies, and it was like almost like a subtle way to talk about what really matters in language that does not bring up, God or religion or orthodoxy or anything like that, but it would still fill you up with this sensation of the transcendent. And again, this desire to look beyond the surface. And looking for the icon behind people's faces, because we're all icons of God, right? And things like that. So that's kind of weird how the whole thing works.
It's fascinating though, because you're talking about a communication again of, well, one, you can't eradicate the human creature's natural desire for the creator, even in all the attempts to suppress it and suffocate it. And here are classic examples. I mean, here's a society from its political angle that wanted to snuff out God and the transcendent, and yet there's such a longing there that when you see someone like Tarkovsky spending hours looking for the sacred in the created order by watching water flow. I mean, they're very long scenes. I'm trying to forget. I forget the name of that movie, but I mean, long scenes of this, and for someone, Western kind of consumers culture, they'd just be like, oh, why are you spending all this time looking at water for, 15 or 20 minutes? They don't realize there's almost a spiritual event happening in that film.
This, your question of what's Tarkovsky after, and Eugene's answer, well, your guess is as good as mine, essentially. It actually reminds me of what Lewis said about myth, that one of the characteristics of myth is you have to encounter it as story. As soon as you start explaining what it means, it stops being myth and starts being allegory. But myth is the thing that connects your experience with ultimate reality. And as a result, myth is subject to multiple interpretations. There's not a single interpretation, because this is reality is not susceptible to being reduced to just one thing. So I think that's one of the things that's going on with Tarkovsky. Perhaps he may have had an idea of what he was doing, but I think it's subject to multiple interpretations as we look at it and treat it functionally as something that's mythic that can bring out multiple layers of meaning from what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. And I think those, I think Christians oftentimes in the West should revisit some of that history and look at what the artists were doing there, because they were trying to do, in a way, a cultural witness to the transcendent, and ultimately, in many ways, they were still Christian at heart. In times when it was, you could be banned for just overstepping your long shot of water. Yeah. I mean, I even think of, like, in Poland, I think Kieslowski, I think he do a series called Decalogue, and what the first one is, "You shall have no other gods before me." And it was I think a weekly television show. And on that one, it was basically a dad who was a scientist, and he put all his confidence in science. And his son wanted to go ice skating, and his dad looked at the temperature and said, "Well, it's going to be okay, so you can go out and do it." And so while the dad is doing experiments, his son goes out to ice skate, but it's actually getting warmer than the temperature, were predicted. And his son ends up, I think, losing his life. And it's basically his father's absolute trust in these technological tools and science. He sacrificed his son for this. And it was one of these penetrating insights on things that, here we are, we put all our trust in, science is going to help us fix that problem or that. And really, you still can't outrun reality and God's control over it.
Yeah.
My baseball metaphor for this is reality bats last.
I'm sorry, reality what?
Bats last.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you got to know baseball, but
yeah.
So, now shifting directions a little bit, you've done several books on the Inklings, insights from them. Can you tell us a little bit about the series?
Yeah, I've just finished my fourth book in the series, and they came, like, pretty much all of them, except for the first one. They came out of the articles that I write on Substack. But the first one was more like I was thinking of writing a thesis and do a PhD on Barfield, which didn't work out. And I had this work, like 20 pages, and I decided to just expand on it. And so that's the first book, 11 Hidden Gems in the Works of the Inklings. And then it gave rise basically to the Philosophy of Language Substack. And I started writing there, and I got in beautiful communication with so many amazing readers and people that, pretty much all the subsequent article was based on something that came before, like some basis that came from the conversations with people that I had. And so the second one was more like plunging into the actual stories, like the Narnia Chronicles and the Silmarillion, and just gleaning some insights into language, and just connections between visible and the invisible outside. And then the third one is just a collection of essays on mystical insights. But this one includes more of the other philosophers like George MacDonald, Heidegger, and sort of kind of branching off into the larger world, kind of beyond the Inklings. But the fourth one that I just published, it's called Fairy Tales for Grown-Ups. This one focuses on myth and meaning specifically, and kind of along the lines like of what is myth and what have we lost when we have lost myth. And what can we gain by simply, plunging back into myth and story? What kind of world are we going to have if we just go back to that and rediscover, myth and meaning? So
it's timely. I know even in, back when I was in my education years in theology, narrative was starting to take precedence in the theological world. Story, again, was becoming a category that everyone was running to because they realized the kind of systematic theology approach that just looked at kind of intellectual ideas and ordered them logically. It has a place, but it disconnects it so much from the heart of things. And so there was a much richer return to that category. And I think what we see is also the way with the classic, philosophers, right? It starts out, mythos precedes logos, the way they put it, even though we understand logos is the source of mythos as Christians, right? The true mythos. But it is interesting the way that without that mythological setting, and I think again we tend to think of myth as something that's the equivalent of fabricated and not real, rather than closer to reality than any kind of analytical approach could ever get. It's much more organic and connected to the way things really are.
That's interesting. What surprises me about myth in general, or mythos in general, is that it's a very simple story. Just like Glenn was saying, it's when you connect, like say, the myth about Pygmalion. When I read it the first time I read it, it didn't quite speak to me until I started creating something with my hands and writing, some essays, way back ago, years ago. And one distinct feeling that I remember getting is after I create something, I almost want it to come alive and have a life separately from me. And then I happened to reread Pygmalion in a very, very simple rendition. I don't know, it wasn't really like, from a book or anything. Just a very simple story like, okay, there was this sculptor and he sculpted the lady out of, rock, and then he just fell in love with her and he wanted her to have a life of her own. He went to Athena and, whoever, Aphrodite, and then she gave her life, and then they married and something resonated. There was nothing in the story besides this mythos that I experienced myself. There was this recognition that happened. But then, of course, it goes back to logos, because that's how God made the world. Yeah. He basically made it because of who he was, and then he wanted it to have a life separate from himself. Yeah. And he wants to marry the world and live, in this marriage, with all things, like heaven and earth must be connected, and they have been connected in Christ ultimately. And so it's just one simple story, probably like 5 lines, but it connects so many things, and it really, really kind of, makes sense out of the world.
And it's interesting. I was when you talk about sort of the way in which creation is always, it's dependent upon the logos. It's through the logos in which it is, and yet it has its own reality, though dependent. It has its own reality. And one of the fascinating things about it is, on the one hand, it's limited because it's a creature. And yet, because it is a creature of this creator, there is a certain kind of unlimitedness about it that no scientific mere description, or let me put it another way, good science too can realize, the more it tries to understand each little created thing, that it opens up a new mystery of what we don't know, because it is such a rich plenitude. And I think mythos is able to get a hold of that rich plenitude of meaning and its harmonies and patterns and interconnectedness, the way they are grounded in the Creator, in the way that they're also open to the Creator as the creature. And when that is tuned into, this is where we begin to, I think, start to have the vocabulary and capacities to see some of the meaning at the heart of things. And I think that's why it's so important to recognize that creation is not this blank slate, but it is a system filled with signs given by the Creator.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you said about narrative. I remember reading in one of Schaeffer's books, the line was, "The gospel is ideas, flaming ideas." Remember that quote. And what I've been struck by recently is that when you read the sermons in the book of Acts, you don't get flaming ideas. What you get are stories. In all of the sermons in Acts, evangelism is done by telling a story. And that, it seems to me, is something that's really missing, I think, in a lot of churches today, especially in more or less my tradition in the Reformed world, where it tends to be, not particularly narrative driven. And yet, like I said, when you look at any account of anything going on in Acts, when they give a speech, it is almost inevitably a story.
Yeah. That's interesting that you say that. Yeah, that's also what I've been feeling as well. That there's a lack of story and almost like a disbelief in the story, unfortunately, or inability to see through. But I'm reminded of this episode in the Book of Acts when Paul and Barnabas went to, I believe the island of Crete, so that Paul was the people there thought that Paul was Hermes, right, and Barnabas was Zeus, basically. And this was kind of a very simple story. I mean, at first, when I first read it, I thought, okay, maybe it's just they're too religious, too pagan, and then they saw a miracle, and then that's what they immediately thought. Gods came down in human form. But then I actually read about Zeus a little bit, after that. And Zeus is electrified. Basically, he is king. He prevailed over Kronos, his father, chronological time. And in terms of human experience, when you prevail over chronological time, that is when you rise above time, you are electrified. And I was always wondering why they would say that. Okay, that it kind of the Bible kind of mentions that they thought that Paul was Hermes because he spoke a lot more than Barnabas did. He was kind of I forgot the exact phrase how it puts it, but basically he kind of preached and delivered the word. But then Barnabas, if he was silent, what did they see in him? Why would they even think? Why didn't they call him somebody else but Zeus? Yeah. So they must have seen some electricity, coming from him, because in their mind, in the Greek mind, right? If somebody has prevailed over time, it must be Zeus. And if he is able to, come down from heaven and manifest himself through these miracles, of course he is Zeus. Why not?
So that's just. Actually, to give you a little bit more background on that, the Greek flood story takes place at Lystra. And what happened was the gods came down and they were not given appropriate hospitality by anyone except one old couple, Deucalion and Phrygia, I believe it was. And so they put those two in a boat and flooded the rest out and destroyed the world. And so I think what's going on in Lystra is they're like, oh, we've seen this story before. We're not going to make the same mistake twice.
Okay. Interesting.
Well, but again, you're dealing with, you're dealing something that was already in their imagination, and that was what they reached for. And it has these levels of meaning. That's why I always found it fascinating that Paul, even Mars Hill. He knows their poems, their philosophers, and he's able to say something I think not even a lot of theologians would be comfortable today, that this one is not far from any one of you. I mean, this is one of the language. He said, this one, if you reach out, if you grope around in the dark, this creator is right there. I mean, this is how close this transcendence gets. It gets closer than anything you're familiar with, and it's so close you can't see it, and you need to be brought into it. But this is something that your temple to the unknown God knew you were missing something.
Yeah. Well, and that altar has got a history.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and so the history becomes really important there as well. Once again, story. And if you don't know what it is, look it up, because it's really
I will. I don't know. I will.
In short version, there was a plague that hit Athens, and someone, I forgot his name, showed up and said, there's a God above the gods that you need to sacrifice to. You don't know him, but you need to sacrifice to him. So they built the altar to the unknown God, sacrificed to him, and the plague stopped. And that's the altar Paul appeals to.
Yeah. Wow.
So anyway, it's it's a fascinating story. And again, all of these little details in the book of Acts, all of these little details, actually anywhere in Scripture, they all unfold, and there's more and more that just come out of it the more you look into it. And it's not just analytical; it's story.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
There are a number of other things I would have liked to have gotten into, but we've only got a few more minutes in our show. But I am really intrigued as well by I think you quoted it in a recent Substack about Tolkien saying that everything came, all of his legendarium came from the language, and the language came from names. That the sound of the names, I mean, the sound of the name Arundel, really just, there was something about the sound that captured his imagination. And that's what began the whole process of creating Middle-earth. As someone who is not a poet or anything like that, the sound of words has never really been something that I put a lot of focus on. For me, they're tools. I mean, historically, they've been tools. I've only just recently begun really thinking more about that. And again, this issue of resonance that you mentioned earlier. Again, these are things that I personally am finding really intriguing. And actually, your writing is helping me kind of focus more thought on that. So,
yeah. Wow. Yeah, I'm reminded of this poem by C.S. Lewis called, I forgot the name now. It's about the planets. So basically, he's like drawing the picture of God as the sun that throws out like logos, like the pieces of logos. And then as they go through the cosmos, they land on Mercury, which is the first planet next to the sun. And Mercury, as the god of language, shapes those intelligible virtues into proper names, And that's, I believe, what Tolkien is referring to. That's my feeling. And that's what he talks about in his letters quite a bit to this guy, Auden. He mentions that, first of all, how he discovered the Finnish grammar, and that just the sound of words really intoxicated him. And he said, basically, without this intoxication with word, you cannot really create a story worth reading. And he basically said, the reason I created the stones was to justify the sound of the name that really hit me. And so the Middle-earth comes out of that. And it's really something, because when we're able to catch those proper names, again, that still come to us from that proto, the pre-Babel times somehow through poetry. We could still access pre-Babel language when we learn to use poetry. You use words in a poetic way with poetic imagination. So it really blows my mind that we can so much can change even in the world, even in politics, I believe, depending on how we use language.
Yeah.
Because there's certainly politicians use language very intentionally and meticulously, because they know what language creates.
Yeah.
It's like chanting and disenchanting and all of that type of thing.
Yeah.
It's like spells and counter spells almost.
Yeah.
Or the voice of Saruman versus the voice of Elvish tongue. And Tolkien actually said that if he could, he would have written The Lord of the Rings in Elvish, but of course nobody would be able to read it. But he said, I really wanted to.
There'd be a few people,
Well, a few, maybe a few.
Well, if he had it in English and Elvish, there would be people certainly who would have read it in Elvish. They'd have studied it and learned it.
Yeah.
Well, we've come to the end of our time here. So, Eugene, before we go, where can people find you?
Well, you can find me on Substack. It's Eugene Terekhin, Philosophy of Language, Substack. I also have a website. I think it's linked there for sure as well. And I'm on Facebook. It's Eugene Terekhin. So it's Evgeny. Where else? I think that's it. And my books are on Amazon as well, and my website. Okay, well, we'll include links in the show notes. Thank you very much for joining us. We really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for this. I hope this continues. It's really, really fun.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and for those of you who've made it to the end of the episode, we once again need to put in our Patreon appeal, because we do have expenses for producing the show. And so for those of you who are already on Patreon, we thank you. And for the rest of you, if you find this valuable, check us out. Okay, so with that, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Nice to meet you guys. So good. Bye. Bye-bye.
Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. The Theology Pugcast is produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.